prince is born, and the kingdom exhales not in joy, but in relief. The crown finally has a spine, wrapped in soft infant skin. They called him precious, divine, a miracle wrapped in velvet. But miracles in this palace do not live long. They are dissected, displayed, and left to rot beneath gold ceilings that do not echo the sound of mercy. England had waited decades for this blood. The boy they prayed for came screaming into a world that would never let him breathe freely. The walls of his nursery were padded with prayers. But outside, men whispered of tombs. What does it mean to be too royal to die well, heir of Henry? Child of prophecy, yet born of death. His mother gave her life for his. A quiet queen with a bleeding cradle. They celebrated with cannon fire while her body turned cold. And so his reign began not with triumph, but with silence, a silence that only grew louder as the years passed. They dressed him in ermine, but the skin beneath never hardened. They filled his ears with scripture, but left his lungs empty. And when he coughed, they smiled as if a king could not die from something so simple. But simple things kill quietly. Moths eat robes, sickness eats sons. He was surrounded by men who bowed too deeply, who smiled too tightly, who prayed too loudly. And all the while, the boy sank. Not into madness, not into rebellion, but into a kind of holy decay, like a relic rotting in its gilded case. You know his name, but you've never heard how he died. Not really. This is not the story of a golden heir. It is the story of a withering flower, pressed beneath the weight of a father's obsession and the silence of a court that watched the bloom blacken. His name was Edward, and he died too cruelly for a king's blood. He was not made for this world, but it made him anyway, stitched from the fevered prayers of a dying queen and the monstrous will of a father who believed thrones could be forged from flesh alone. Edward Tudor, crowned before his bones could hold their own weight, sat like a porcelain relic in a court that devoured softness. His limbs were too narrow for armor, his voice too mild for decrees, and yet they dressed him as a lion. His cradle stood where corpses once bled. His tutors did not speak to him. They carved scripture into his soul like blades on bark. He blinked beneath heavy windows stained with saints and sins alike. His breath always visible in the cold chambers where no fire dared burn too loud. He was raised on silence, the kind of silence that smells like ink, wax, and dying roses, the kind that holds its breath for you. Edward's childhood was less a life than a performance. Every nod measured, every phrase rehearsed. Behind every curtain, men in robes of black and red plotted futures he would not live to see. He was called wise before he understood his own body. He was called holy while disease nested beneath his ribs. The court praised his virtue, but they feared his weakness more. A king must not bleed. A king must not tremble. And yet Edward did both. In private, in shadow, in sheets stained with blood that no servant would speak of. The palace watched with mouths full of loyalty and eyes full of dread. Henry VIII had built this boy from desperation, a final offering to a god that no longer answered. The old king's footsteps still haunted the corridors like distant drums. His wrath lingered in corners, thick and unbreathing. Edward felt it. Everyone did. No one grieved Henry. Not truly. They feared his memory like one fears the echo of a wound that never closed. But Edward, they pitied him. And pity, in royal courts, is deadlier than poison. His skin was pale even in summer. His fingers trembled even when still. When he smiled, it looked like surrender. The physicians whispered of humors, of imbalance, of bad air, but never dared name the decay. His lungs betrayed him first. A cough, dry and light like a moth's wing, fluttering in his throat. Then again, and again. Soon, he was coughing blood. Not in torrents, but in threads veins of red laced through lace. His bedding began to carry the scent of salt and rot, but the prayers continued, louder now, like shouting into a void that refused to echo back. His council, drunk on proximity to the crown, refused to speak of death. To speak of death was to summon it, so they spoke of inheritance instead, and treaties, and suitors for the sisters he'd barely met. They paraded ambassadors through the hall like vultures with silken tongues. Edward, propped up with cushions, recited verses through chapped lips. He was a boy playing the part of a dying god, and they fed on the performance. Sometimes, in the quiet between audiences, he would press his palm to the frost-covered window and watch the crows gather on the distant spires. He envied them, not for their wings, but for the certainty of the wind beneath them. His court offered only stillness, still beds, still hands, still lies. He began to smell things that weren't there. Smoke where no fire burned, blood in water. He'd wake with nosebleeds and call it penance. He believed suffering made him sacred. The more he bled, the closer he felt to heaven. His confessor encouraged the thought. Holiness, after all, is easier to control than rebellion. They crowned him young because they had to, because Henry's ghost would not permit delay, because the realm demanded a boy king they could mold. But Edward, though fragile, was not stupid. He knew the prayers were not for him. They were for the throne. The throne did not cough. The throne did not tremble. The throne did not die, but Edward was dying. Slowly, softly. His decay was not dramatic, it was a shadow, stretching longer by the day, swallowing him without ceremony. Even the bells in the chapel began to ring more softly, as if ashamed to mark the hours. His servants walked lighter. His nurses cried where he couldn't see, and yet still, they insisted he was improving, that the fever would pass, that the heir of Henry could not fade like this. But he did, and the court watched. Not with horror, but calculation. For power does not grieve, it waits. It plans. And as Edward's breath grew shallower, the rooms grew fuller. Advisors, regents, spies with rosaries and daggers alike. The boy king's room became a stage, his suffering a script rehearsed by every man who dreamed of crowns. Still he endured, wrapped in wool and denial. They fed him milk laced with honey and herbs. He vomited. They tried again. They burned incense to mask the rot. He smiled to reassure them. And all the while, his bones hollowed, his spine curved, his eyes darkened. They said it was consumption, but the truth was simpler. The throne consumed him, just as it had consumed his mother, his father, and soon his name, Edward VI. The title rang like prophecy and requiem alike. A boy dressed as a monarch, dying like a ghost that never quite belonged. In his final weeks, he spoke less and less, not from pain, but from knowing it no longer mattered. The words would not save him. The crown would not save him. God, perhaps, would not save him either. And yet, in the stillness of those last days, he found a kind of clarity, a cold peace, the peace of understanding he had never been loved, only needed. And when need dies, so does the beloved. He stopped asking for his sisters. He stopped asking for light. He closed his eyes and waited not for death, but for the silence that came before it. The court outside prepared documents, succession plans, marriages, mourning clothes, and Edward, the precious son of Henry VIII, lay alone in a room so quiet it felt already buried. His hands, once folded in prayer, now clutched nothing. Not a crucifix, not a relic, not a name, only air that would not stay. His skin turned waxen, his breath rasped like parchment torn too slowly, and the courtiers waited, like priests at a sacrifice, not for salvation, but for the moment the crown lifted from his head and became theirs. They said it was natural what befell him, that no poison touched his lips, that no blade kissed his throat. But nature in a palace is not the same as nature in the woods. Here, it wears a mask. Here, it smells like lavender over rot, incense over infection, flattery over treason. Edward's death may not have come from a dagger, but it came from men all the same. Men who bowed too low, who smiled too wide, who signed letters in candlelight with hands that shook only from anticipation. The conspiracy was not loud, so it did not scream. It whispered, in Latin, in scripture, in silks. It began before his first cough, long before his limbs failed to warm in spring. The boy was a puzzle piece, a placeholder. His usefulness had an expiry date carved into his lungs by providence, or perhaps by poison disguised as mercy. No one confessed. No one needed to. When a child coughs blood in a palace like this, it is not illness, it is timing. The lords of the council had already begun to weigh his breath like coin. The Lord Protector, his own uncle, saw the boy as leverage, not legacy. A crown on a child's head is a noose around another man's neck or a ladder, depending on how steady the child's pulse is. Edward was no fool. Even as his body betrayed him, his mind remained intact longer than any of them hoped. He read between silences. He heard betrayal in the rustle of robes. They smiled at him and whispered of peace, but their eyes darted toward the windows, always calculating where the sun fell and how many shadows it cast. Edward watched his Uncle Seymour speak of duty with a gaze that never met his own. He knew what it meant to be used, even by blood, especially by blood. And Jane, his mother, though long dead, hovered like a phantom in the decisions they made for him. Her memory used like a shield, a bargaining chip, a crown of thorns twisted into lullabies. He once asked, quietly, if his mother's death had meant something. The silence that followed was the most honest thing he ever heard. He stopped asking questions after that. Those who surrounded him had answers, always, but never the truth. They fed him narratives, not knowledge. And the truth he began to uncover tasted like ash. The plans were already written, not on scrolls, but on glances, on doors closed too softly, on absences that stretched too long. Edward had favored Protestant reform, not from rebellion, but because he truly believed it mattered. The scriptures moved him. He saw in them not power, but purity. But power has no use for purity, not when it costs influence, not when it threatens tradition. His convictions made him inconvenient. Even as he wasted away, his preferences still rattled the alliances his council had built with trembling hands. The Catholics prayed for his soul. The Protestants prayed for his survival, and both prepared for his death. One morning, when his cough grew wetter, when his lips cracked from the dryness of too many whispered prayers, he awoke to find his own handwriting being mimicked. His uncle's hand guiding policy in his name, his voice distorted through official proclamations he had not approved. The king was still breathing, but his will was already being edited. He had become a puppet in his own bed. Even his signature began to look foreign. They called it governance. He called it betrayal. The worst of it was not the pain, not the blood, not the fever, not the weight of his failing limbs. The worst of it was knowing he was already gone, even as his heart still beat. He was a ghost wrapped in royal linens, used to haunt documents and control the living. The plot did not need poison. It needed only patience. And he, the boy king, gave them that. With every breath, with every night he failed to die, he gave them time to prepare. Lady Jane Grey, his cousin, was whispered into succession lines before his body was even cold. His father's wish had been clear, a male heir, strong and divine. But divinity is fragile when it breathes too shallowly. And so they shifted the prophecy, adjusted the crown to fit a different head. Edward's sister, Mary, fierce in faith, loomed at the edges. Her Catholic blood too thick, too dangerous. They feared her fires. They feared Elizabeth's cunning more. So Jane, pale and pliable, became the answer. A girl with no army, no shadow, no ambition, or so they hoped. Edward was told, in his final hours, that it was his will, that he had chosen Jane, that God had inspired his hand. But by then, his mouth barely moved. His lungs no longer held full words. He could not speak for himself, and so they spoke for him, wrote for him, replaced his voice with their own. In death, he became louder than he had ever been in life. But it was not his song they sang. It was the song of survival, of men preserving thrones through rewritten prayers. Edward did not rage. He did not scream. That was not the kind of boy he was. He withdrew. His eyes, once bright with question, became mirrors, cold, reflective, silent. They watched him as he faded and called it obedience. He watched them as he vanished and called it truth. In his final moments, he was not surrounded by family, but by strategists. No mother to kiss his forehead, no father to hold his hand. Only parchment, ink, and trembling hands positioning a kingdom. And in that room, thick with the scent of melted wax and damp stone, a boy king became a symbol, not of rule, not of righteousness, but of what happens when power uses purity as scaffolding. His crown, polished and waiting, was passed before the body cooled. His name, once etched in stained glass, was now a footnote in strategy. And the men who loved him most in public wept the least in private. Their tears had dried long before his lungs did. And as the bells rang, not in mourning, but in transition, Edward's final legacy was not his faith, not his youth, not his blood, but the silence he left behind. A silence that echoed in the throne room, in the chapel, in the private corridors where secrets were signed and sealed. The silence of a child who knew he was never meant to live long. Only long enough to be used, long enough to be remembered as a name, not a person. And in that silence, England marched on. They dressed his corpse as they had dressed his life in symbols he could not carry. Velvet dyed deeper than blood, laced with pearls that once lined his christening robes, now cold against a chest that no longer rose. They bound his fingers in rings of inheritance, slid a gilded cross between hands that never held a sword, and laid him beneath the vaulted ceiling of Westminster as if death had crowned him more truly than life ever could. But the kingdom did not pause. Mourning was brief, formal, and quiet, the kind of grief that smells like candle smoke and iron polish. As his body decayed, plans bloomed. Lady Jane Grey, already instructed, was led like a lamb into the hall of waiting wolves. Her crown had been carved while Edward still breathed. The men behind her did not look at her face. They looked at the map behind her name. Edward's legacy was not his vision. It was his absence. And in that absence, everyone reached. Elizabeth stayed silent, watching from the margins. Mary burned prayers into her chamber walls. The realm began to divide before the stone on Edward's grave had cooled. In that division, he disappeared. He became soft fiction child king, holy martyr, porcelain soul too pure for rule. But those close enough to his final breath knew better. They knew the rot had not come from within alone. It had come from the silence of 1,000 decisions too small to name, each one laid carefully like brickwork leading to an open grave. They knew that by the time Edward had been placed into the earth, he had already been buried by politics, by prophecy, by fear. His reign had lasted 6 years, his life 15, but he had never ruled. not truly. He had been carried, dressed, displayed, and finally removed. He had been the illusion of continuity, the breath between monarchs. And now, in the space his death left, the old ghosts rose. The Reformation trembled. The crown pulsed with instability. The nobles sharpened their alliances like blades. Even in death, Edward's body held weight not as a symbol of strength, but as proof that the Tudor line bled, decayed, and could vanish just like any other. His sarcophagus, elaborate and cold, became a monument not to power, but to fragility. Beneath it, he did not rest, he lingered. Not in spirit, not in myth, but in what was never said. The physicians who had failed him were never questioned. The letters that bore his name in a hand, not his own, were locked in archives. The prayers spoken over his body were the same that had failed to keep him alive. The nation moved forward by erasing him. But Edward had seen this coming. In the last hours, before his lips cracked open one final time, he tried to write. Not a decree, not a sermon, just a line he could leave behind, unfiltered. The ink smeared. His hand shook. The parchment vanished. Burned, perhaps, by a servant sworn to protect the image of perfection, or perhaps hidden, buried with him, folded over his heart like a final whisper. No one will ever know. And that is the cruelest fate for a child bred to rule, to die not as himself, but as a version of silence everyone agreed to maintain. A death too cruel for a king's blood is not marked by violence, it is marked by emptiness. Edward did not scream, he did not curse. He simply disappeared into the machinery that created him. His portrait remained, framed and dusted. His sermons were reprinted, his name etched into metal. But the boy behind the crown, the one who watched crows gather, who tasted blood each time he spoke, who whispered for his mother in the fevered dark, was gone long before the coffin closed. He had no monument of love, only one of lineage. No one wrote songs for him. No one carved his words into marble. What they remembered was what was useful: his quietness, his piety, his role. And what they buried, along with his body, was everything else. The coughs, the doubt, the loneliness, the slow realization that he had never been more than a beautiful delay. A lamb whose throat they watched for the moment it stopped pulsing. He was mourned in candles and silence. Yes, but also in relief. The realm no longer had to pretend he could rule. They could now write their future without the burden of his fragility. And yet, in that relief, the shadow he left behind was heavier than any crown. Because Edward was not just a lost king, he was a reminder that even royal blood curdles, that even chosen sons rot, that the divine right to rule means nothing to the lungs. The throne is not merciful. It takes, it consumes, it waits. Edward gave it everything he had, and still it demanded more. Even his memory was devoured, recast into legend, or erased into silence, depending on who held the quill. But some things resist forgetting. Some deaths, even quiet ones, echo, and Edward's did. In the way Jane Grey trembled at her coronation, in the way Mary raised fires instead of flags, in the way Elizabeth walked with shadows stitched into her every glance. He was gone, but never truly absent. His image lingered in every decision, a boy-shaped ghost reminding them of how fragile a dynasty truly was. And perhaps that is the real cruelty, not the sickness, not the scheming, but that the child who died in his bed, cold and alone, ended up haunting them all not in legend, but in the choices they made to forget him. Beneath the marble, his bones do not rest. They remain clenched, curled, silent, not from peace, but from refusal. Refusal to become what they wanted him to be: a clean myth, a holy death, a memory without teeth. The bells that tolled for him rang once, then stopped, as if ashamed to announce a burial that had begun long before the grave. There were no screams, no cries, just wax dripping from royal candles and the soft drag of silk against stone as they turned to the next. And yet he remains, in the dust that clings to portraits, in the pages they sealed, in the shadows behind thrones polished too often. The boy who died like a prayer never answered. They called him Edward, precious, promised, but the truth never wore a crown. It wore a cough, a trembling hand, a silence no anthem dares echo. So when you walk the halls where he once sat, do not speak, do not pray, only listen. And if you hear nothing, listen harder. The absence is his voice, and it has never stopped.